We're going through a series this Easter season on evangelization in the body, the physicality of conversion. And today I wanted to talk about a touchy subject for many, the evangelization of children. You know, we have little kids at home, so this is something I'm deeply interested in because it's an issue I'm going to be facing soon.
That's right.
Yeah.
And in the series, we've been talking about relational evangelization, that our ideals stand above our behaviors, but relationships stand over our ideals. So we're formed by the people we love and the people who love us. And of course, when we think about this, we might think, how on earth does any child lose the faith? Because who loves them more than their parents? But the reality is that many children do struggle to keep the faith of their family, and many parents probably struggle even more with the reality that their children don't practice the faith. There's a process that goes on in childhood called separation and individuation. This happens first when the kids are little toddlers, but then again when they're teenagers. And this is often the moment when parents struggle with their children's faith belief. Some of the things that start happening in this process is the de-idealization of parents. It's not that they think poorly of their parents, they just start to see you for who you actually are.
Right.
Right. And the reality is none of us are perfect. And this is a process they have to go through. They start to widen the distance. That toddler starts to walk away from the parents a little bit further. Well, those teenagers, when you give them their car especially, they're going to get even further away. And they're going to start with the process of experimentation, where they're trying to figure out what do they actually like. Not what do their parents think they should like or what their family does, but what do they actually like? And there's stages in this identity development. First is identity diffusion. Things just sort of fall apart. They're open with more of a blank slate and they have to figure it out. There can be a process of identity foreclosure. This is where the young person actually gives up on learning for themselves and just sort of accepts their parents' values without really being critical or without going through that process. And this can be as dangerous as them finding the wrong thing because that diffusion can happen later in life when they're outside of the home. There's a period of identity moratorium. This is that active stage of exploration where they're sort of putting a hold on what they believe to figure it out. And then finally, identity achievement. This is the synthesis where they've discovered for themselves who they want to be and what they want to know and love. There's many influences in this process, like peers, cultural context, their own reasoning, and then a new one is digital identity. Oftentimes, the online space is a place where this experimentation can happen, where the young person can assume different identities and sort of try different things on. The way somebody might go into a changing room of a store and try on different outfits. You can try on different identities on the internet. Just create a new Facebook account and get going and see how people react. So how do parents handle this situation when their children are around this age? Obviously, you want them to go through this process of developing their own identity. You can't just force it on them. But on the other hand, you really want them to keep the faith. Well, the first thing is modeling living the faith over teaching the faith. They're going to be inspired by what you do more than what you say. And at this point, you've kind of gotten your chance to get your word in. Now it's their turn to go out and figure out what they actually agree with. And the way you live your life is going to be much more influential in this than continuing to try to give those lessons that you gave them earlier in childhood, because they need to go through that process. The second thing is safe autonomy, distinguishing what's the core of your values versus what's the casing of the values. What are the non-negotiables in the household versus what you can be flexible with? There's a lot of things that maybe you could be a little more flexible and let them experiment, but then establishing what are those non-negotiables in the household of them living the faith. The third thing is active listening. The idea here is wherever they go to express their doubts, that's probably where they're going to be most strongly influenced. If they can't express their doubts with you safely, you're not going to be the primary influence in this process. If it's their friends or some other adult in their life that maybe doesn't share values with you, those people are going to be highly influential in where they end up. We have to move into a mode of collaborative decision-making, move from dictation to dialogue. You, of course, as the parent, you have the final word in the household, but they have to be involved in the decision-making. Here I almost think of like the pastor talking to the pastoral council in the parish. You know, they have to go and consult and decide together. And maybe there's moments where you got to put your foot down. And then you have to allow for natural consequences. This is a really important one. I know for me, with toddlers at home, you want to protect them all the time. You want to stop them from every scrape and bruise and everything that they might do wrong. But a great way to learn is to fall over.
Yeah.
And of course, as you get older, the consequences can get bigger. So you got to protect them from grave consequences and life-changing things. But on the other hand, sometimes they got to make some mistakes and learn from those.
And that's the tough part, right? Watching them do that.
Yeah. So what do you do if your children are already through this phase? You're not very happy with where they landed. You have that kid in their mid-20s or 30s, and they're not going to church. Their kids aren't getting baptized. A lot of people struggle. My grandbabies aren't baptized. So one thing we have to do is disentangle the identity. The children have disentangled their identity from you. You need to disentangle your identity from your children. I mean, you've got to get really honest about your motivations. Are you really worried about your salvation, or do you just think they're making you look bad? Do you really care about their well-being, or are you just trying to cope with your own anxieties and fears? We have to go through a really honest, heart-level searching process of purifying our motives with our own children. Second thing is over-invest and under-challenge. We talked earlier in the series about the need to invest in relationships, sometimes 10 or 20 times before you make one challenge, one invitation. And oftentimes what happens is parents will get to the point where every time they interact with that child, they're challenging. Why don't you come to church with me? Why don't you get them baptized? Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? And as you do that, the children push further and further away. So we got to sometimes double and triple the amount of investment versus challenging. Because the reality is the kids just expect the parents to invest. That's parenthood. So they're not really very moved by it because it's just the status quo. So in order to really move the heart of the child, there needs to be an overinvestment and an under-challenging. The third thing is ask honest questions and accept the honest answers. If your children aren't going to church, maybe just ask them. And whatever they say, you got to receive it. Maybe there's things that you did to wound them. Maybe they don't even understand their own history very well. Maybe they've sort of made up a story about you to make sense of how they feel. Maybe something difficult happened at church or at Catholic school. Who knows what the situation is? Ask the honest question, and to receive it without judgment, without defending yourself, without argument, can be really impactful. The fourth thing here is repentance. We as parents have to build a habit of repenting to our children, and this can be a really powerful impact on them. And the final thing is prayer. And we have great examples like St. Monica. There's great prayer groups around town called Millions of Monicas, where mothers that struggle with this will get together and pray. But that power of prayer, ultimately, I think, is where we have to rely. So these are just a little bit of framework and context on how do we evangelize our children once they enter this teenage and adult phase.
It's interesting, Andrew, because Father Joseph Gill was on The Virtuous Life, and one of the things that he said in regards to parents whose kids no longer go to church and how worried they get about that is he brought up the whole thing of technology, that you used to live in your family, in a community, and that was your world. That was your worldview in a sense. Now all these other things come into your child's life. He said, in fact, almost build a different culture sometimes, depending on how much they're connected to online things. And he says, so you got to take that into consideration. They're not necessarily living in your culture. So it kind of ties into some of the things you're saying.
So a lot of people are proponents of sort of delaying that exposure. On the other hand, you can't completely delay it.